at Wright State and seeing an end in sight. She's going to graduate in May. She received her Bachelor of Arts in Anthropology and Psychology and a Master of Higher Education Administration at The Ohio State University. After spending 12 years working in administrative positions within higher education, she then decided that it was time for a change and time to pursue her love of history. While enrolled in the public history program, Robin has pursued some of her interest areas focusing on the Civil War, Native American history, and the local history of Yellow Springs, of course. Her capstone project involved completing deed research on some of the historical homes in town, and that's what she's going to focus on today, both on what the results of her discovery and a little bit of how to do that research, which I think a lot of us are interested in. She's a member of Phi Alpha Theta and Golden Key International Honor Societies, as well as a board member of our Historical Society, as I mentioned. She's currently a graduate assistant in the Department of History at Wright State University, as well as administrative support assistant at the Greene County Record Center, and hopefully she'll tell us a little bit about the Record Center and how to access the archives there. And they just went through a move, and there'll be some interesting information about that. And upon graduation in June, she hopes to continue to research the local history of Yellow Springs, and we hope she does too. Thanks, Bob.
Thank you. I'm really glad to see all of you here today. I'd like to extend a thank you also to the Historical Society for sponsoring this event. As Dave said, this what I'm sharing with you today is kind of the end of my research project for my master's degree in public history at Wright State. So I'm going to share with you today some of the highlights of my research. I'm not going to share all of it with you because we don't have enough time. There's a book actually on the table if you're interested in looking at after the program. That's some of the research that I did. Those are the documents that I copied. So as you can see, it's like this thick, so if I went through all of that with you, we'd be here for quite a while. But although my primary reason for completing this project was to fulfill an educational requirement, I was also interested in getting a better understanding of the village that I've called home for the last 7 years, because I've lived here and I hear a lot about the history, but being from out of town, I don't really know a lot of it. So this has really been an interesting experience for me. You can go ahead and go to the next page, please. It's too far. There we go. Thank you.
You get what you pay for.
So initially I had planned on researching 40 properties in the historic district of Yellow Springs. But it didn't take very long for me to figure out that this was a bit ambitious plan for me to take on. So I ultimately completed the research on 12 properties within the village, and not all of them were actually located within the historical district. My initial plan for the project was to document the histories of the various buildings and properties, primarily doing deed research and looking at tax records. But as my project began to evolve, I became fascinated by some of the histories of the property owners and their stories. And I kind of want to highlight the fact that they were property owners and not necessarily the people who lived within the homes, because we don't always know that. Just because they owned the home, they may have rented it out, they didn't necessarily live there. And next slide, please. The title of this presentation, Yellow Springs Heritage, was inspired by one of the definitions that I found on the word heritage, which is valued objects and qualities such as cultural traditions, unspoiled countryside, and historic buildings that have been passed down from previous generations. And so that seemed fitting to me since I was doing property research and specifically looking at buildings initially. Heritage, Yellow Springs Heritage seemed like a really good title for the program in my research project. And next building. So the very first, and actually I need you to hit space one more time, please. There we go. The very first property that I took a look at is really the only property that does not have the original building still standing. But for me, again, being somebody that's not from Yellow Springs originally, I had heard it referred to Mills Lawn, obviously, but I had also heard it referred to as the Means property. And I always wondered, why do people call it the Means property? There's got to be some history here. And for those of you who are from Yellow Springs, the name William Mills, you know that name. It's pretty familiar to you. But for those of you who are not from Yellow Springs, William Mills is considered by some to be the father of Yellow Springs. The original Mills homes on the properity, if I can get you to click the space one time. Thank you. That's a sketch of it that's on the 1855 Greene County map. The original Mills home was built around 1843. Oops, I lost the light.
Is that too much, Robin?
We need
Little
to be
bit.
able to see our pad.
Thank you.
So, okay.
Thank you. The grounds of the residence on the Mills property was filled with various gardens and pathways, and people would come from all over town just to walk through the park. And they could come at any time, and Mills was okay with that. I guess this was Yellow Springs' version of Central Park. We had our own Central Park from the sounds of it. So William Mills, again, for those of you who aren't familiar with him, in 1845, he traveled to Boston and secured the capital needed to bring the Little Miami Railroad through Yellow Springs. And he understood, being the businessman that he was, the importance of bringing the railroad to Yellow Springs for economic growth and prosperity here in the village. And then in 1852, he offered 20 acres and a pledge of $30,000 to the Christian church for them to choose Yellow Springs for the home of Antioch College. So again, the hope was, we're going to bring the railroad, we're going to bring this educational institution, we're going to build this town. 1853, Mills hired a surveyor to parcel off a portion of his land into 436 lots. 37 streets were among these lots, and then he paid with his own money to have them all graded and graveled. And then in November of 1853, the plan and map of Yellow Springs was recorded by the Greene County Surveyor in Xenia. And you can actually, I have a portion of the copy of that map in my book that's available in Greene County. And for some of you, you probably do know this, that Mills began to have some financial problems during the Depression of 1857. And by 1861, he'd fallen on hard times and decided to enlist in the Union Army. He was the post quartermaster of the 74th Ohio Volunteer Infantry stationed in Nashville, Tennessee, and he stayed there until July of 1865. The next notable person that owned this property was William Means. According to tax and deed records, William Means purchased this property in 1866. Means was a successful businessman in the iron and coal industry. And according to the last will and testament of his wife, Martha, that was written in October 1901, Means lost everything with the failure of the Metropolitan Bank in Cincinnati. And she was required to support the family and exhausted her patrimony. If you actually read her last will and testament, it's pretty funny. You can hear how upset she was at this particular bank for taking all her husband's money. Upon her death, her estate was divided between her 3 daughters. And William and his daughter, one of his daughters, Pearl, continued to live in the house until his death in 1921. Prior to her father's death, Pearl's sister, Gertrude Julian, and her husband sold the property to Antioch College with the stipulation that Pearl and her father could remain in the house for the remainder of William's life. Upon her father's death in 1921, Pearl could not bring herself to leave the home that had been in her family for over 50 years. And that picture in the lower right-hand corner, that is a picture of Pearl. So she couldn't bring herself to leave the family home. And the headline of a local newspaper that I found reported, "Woman loses battle to retain home. With pets, she faces cheerless future." So Pearl didn't have a good life after this, obviously. The story of Pearl and the Means property, Scott Sanders shared with me, and he refers to Pearl as pistol-packing Pearl. A year after her father's death, Pearl still refused to leave her family home. After repeated requests and offers of assistance to move her out of the home, Antioch College had no choice. They had to take legal action against her. Pearl was taken to court, where she agreed that she no longer had a right to live on the property, but she still refused to leave. She wasn't going anywhere. So a few days later, the constable was sent to serve her with official papers that she needed to vacate the premises. And when he arrived, Pearl was waiting on the porch with her shotgun. She wasn't going to go without a fight. The constable left and later returned with some sheriff deputies from Xenia, and they removed Pearl from the home, and she was briefly retained in the county jail. The article goes on to say that Pearl and her dog stayed with a friend of hers that apparently lived at the Little Antioch School across the street. And her cat also refused to move from the home and stayed on the front porch, and Pearl was seen every day walking to the house feeding her cat on the front porch. So eventually, Pearl was she left the home. So at this point, Antioch College could make the necessary renovations on the property, and the house served as a dormitory for Antioch College between 1922 and 1948. In 1949, Antioch College gave the deed for Mills Lawn to the Yellow Springs School Board, and in 1953, Mills Lawn School opened. So that's Mills Lawn. Next, please.
Was there a demolition house?
It was,
48,
I think it was in 48. Don't quote me on that, but I believe it was in 48.
No, because it was,
It was in the 60s?
Yeah.
Okay.
because I think I went to nursery school there.
Okay. Good to know. Thank you. Okay, next slide, please. Might have to do it one more time. And another. Okay, that's the last one I think it does that did. So the next property I looked into was the Octagon House, which again was a unique house to Yellow Springs that I was always interested and curious about what the history was behind the home. This house, according to tax and deed records, was built around 1856 by Julius Cohn. Julius was a local surveyor. He was also an inventor, which I did not know until I worked on this research. He invented an alarm lock, and that is a little drawing of it over here. It was patented in 1858. And this alarm lock, apparently, it was something you could place on a drawer, and there was a steel rod, and there was a secret compartment that you could actually release the rod to open the drawer. And if you didn't know what the secret release was, and you tried to pry the door open, then this alarm would sound, and so it would alert everyone that somebody was trying to get into your belongings. So apparently Julius Cohn invented that. Julius was also the drum major for the 154th Ohio Volunteer Infantry. That was organized on May 9th, 1864, primarily operated in Virginia, and unfortunately Cohn died in 1865 from wounds that he received during his service in the 154th. Next page.
Do we have an address for that? I don't know where it is.
It is on,
West Whiteman.
I don't have it with me, I've got it, I don't have it up here with me, but I can give
Send
it
it
to you.
right there.
Yeah.
West Whiteman.
As I mentioned, Julius Cohn was a surveyor, and this is a copy of the 1855 map of Yellow Springs. And Julius Cohn, his own name's down here, he's credited with this. Something you can note over here, this little green patch is Antioch College. Up there is Mills Lawn, that green patch near the top. This is a wonderful map if you're doing property research. It gives you the names of the streets and some of the property owners. Also, a home we're going to talk about in a little bit, the Hamilton House. It actually shows a brick kiln on the property, which was a clue to his background as well. So this is just a handy tool if you're going to be doing some property research. The other interesting thing about this is while I was completing my research, I kept a blog documenting my experience. And with each entry, I would tag the appropriate subjects areas. And so, for instance, this one, oh, I'm sorry.
Where was the brick kiln located? Which property?
We'll get to it, but it's down here on Xenia
Not on
Avenue.
the Octagon.
No, not on the Octagon. We'll get to it here in a little bit. But as I kept my blog, I would tag each entry with a subject area, and I did write something about the 1855 Julius Cohn map and tagged it with Julius Cohn. A few days later, I got a notice from my blog that somebody had a question for me, and apparently it was the great-great-grandson of Julius Cohn, Michael Cohn, who was doing some genealogy research of his own. And he had never known that Julius Cohn was responsible for surveying Yellow Springs or had put this map together. He had questions for me about Julius. He also provided me with the patent information on the alarm lock, and I hadn't heard about it until I heard from his great-great-grandson, Michael Cohn. So it was really kind of interesting with me doing my research and he was doing his research, and we've never met, but yet we were able to share some information with each other. He's from New York. He's planning now on coming to Yellow Springs to visit the Octagon House, hopefully in the next year, because he's really intrigued. So just kind of a fun little bit about my research. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, we're going to move on to Elm Street. The tax records suggest that this house was built around 1859. Not all of the houses that I researched have a really exciting history with them, but there are some familiar names that you'll see. This is one of the homes. This one was built by Calvin Pennell. He was a nephew of Horace Mann and also an early faculty member at Antioch College. In 1859, Abraham Wambaugh, who was a local attorney at the time, purchased the property. Then in 1864, it was purchased by Jeremiah Little, who was a local farmer, but he was another local inventor. Apparently, he invented a new and improved way of manufacturing corn and hominy flakes, which I found interesting. And what was it? We had the American Hominy Company that was here in Yellow Springs at the time. So he improved the ability to manufacture those, which was interesting. And again, in 1965 to 1966, the property switched hands. It now belonged to Antioch College, and they used it for a year for their Peace Corps office. That's kind of a little interesting facts on that. Next. Walnut Street. This was another one of those homes that I found extremely interesting, that I ended up finding a really interesting story behind it. The tax records for this Gothic-inspired home suggest that it was built around 1858, again by Calvin Pennell. The most notable property owner of this particular property was Colonel Thomas Chew. And I had originally, when I was doing the research, found the records for him, and I don't believe he owned the property until the 30s or 40s. It was a while. He didn't initially own it. But I had found it, I attached his name to the property, and I happened to be looking through some Greene County cemetery and inscription book, and I found his name. And what I found is the inscription on his tombstone reads, engineer, artist, founder of the World Citizen Movement, born in China, migrated to America. And at this point, that's all I knew about him, and I thought, wow, he sounds like a really interesting guy. There's got to be more to this man. So again, I went home and I decided to Google him, put his name in on Google. I found a poster from the University of Iowa Library that described Chew as a brilliant Chinese philosopher, scholar, soldier, statesman, and world citizen. And again, that's all I really knew about him. Wow, he sounds really exciting. So I wrote about him on my blog again, and I thought, you know, who is this guy? Obviously, we've got some great history here in Yellow Springs, and this is somebody I'd never heard about. And again, I'm not from Yellow Springs, but I've never heard about him. And, you know, he has had a global impact, so clearly he was important at one time. So again, I wrote the blog. A few days later, I'm contacted. This time, I'm contacted by a PhD student from Hong Kong that was working on her dissertation on planning and property relations in China during the 1920s. What are the chances? She happened to be looking up Chew when she stumbled upon my blog post. So she ended up providing me with some biographical information on him, including some information that in 1921 he became the executive secretary of the industrial department of the YMCA, where he studied the labor conditions within China and began reform efforts. He traveled throughout Europe and America, becoming an ardent advocate for social legislation and education of workers, and also improving educational and housing conditions of the working class. It's been suggested that Chew was a descendant of the great 12th Chinese philosopher and Confucian scholar Chu Xi. He was also known as one of China's foremost painters. So who knew? And he was also served as secretary to Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek in the Chinese army. So pretty interesting guy.
And he's buried in Glen Forest, right?
Pardon?
He's buried in Glen Forest.
He is buried in Glen Forest. Apparently he went to college in Glasgow, Scotland, which is where he met his wife. And then they both immigrated to the United
His
States.
wife used to be my babysitter.
Oh, really?
In the early 50s.
Yay.
And his daughter-in-law lives in Boulder, Colorado. She used to teach biology at Bryan High School.
Oh, is
And,
it Janet Chew?
She's a birder of some note. Now, she's on Facebook. She's a friend of a friend. I haven't been in contact with her lately. But
Janet Chew.
her husband, who is the son of he and the Scottish woman, died, I think, about 10 years ago. And he's buried out there, too, right next to us.
Was her name Agnes?
No, her name was Jan Paty originally, and then she married and then she became Janet Chew. He spelled his name, removed the T, her husband. In fact, I think it was just CHU.
Yeah.
Good to know.
But I remember her wife's Scottish accent when I was about 4 years old.
Good. Oh, I mean,
I'm not sure why she was babysitting. Fell on hard times or what.
Did you ever find out how they ended up in Yellow Springs?
I never found that out. Actually, the PhD student from Hong Kong was really surprised that he ended up here in Yellow Springs. She wanted to know that answer too, but I never did find out. So, okay, next slide, please. Okay, the Cox House. Tax records suggest that this beautiful Greek Revival influenced home was built around 1850 by Samuel and Mary Ann Gilmore. According to the 1850 federal census, Samuel was a dry goods merchant here in town. In 1851, the Gilmores sold the property to William Mills, who then sold the property and a very large brick house, according to the deed, to Duncan McGee in the same year. This house was also owned by Calvin Pennell. He owned quite a few of the homes in that area at one point. Again, the nephew of Horace Mann. In the late 1860s, this home was owned briefly by a D.M. Moore, who was a former minister of the Presbyterian Church. And then the Samuel Coxon family owned the property from 1885 to 1947. And Cox was the town blacksmith and was also a veteran of the Civil War, Company A of the Ohio 154th Ohio Volunteer Infantry.
Where is this?
This is on the corner of Elm and Walnut Street. And it has been, I'm sorry, was there?
Well, is that the one where General Rosecrans lived?
It's been suggested that General Rosecrans, not himself, but his family lived in this house at some point during the Civil War, if I can get you to move on. And so that was one of the things I set out to do, was find out, can I get any evidence that actually documents that he lived in this house or his family lived in this house. And I found out during my research that the Special Collections Department at UCLA happens to have the Rosecrans family papers. So I wrote them and asked if they could look to see if there were any letters back and forth between General Rosecrans and his wife during this period that might be postmarked from Yellow Springs. And I got back, probably a month later, I got a response back from the staff member who sent me a letter, and this is just one page of the letter. And in the letter, apparently Mr. General Rosecrans and his wife had a bet during the Civil War as to who could write the other one the most letters. And in this particular letter, she's apologizing to him because when he brought his trunk home, she cleaned out a bunch of the letters, and the letters that I was looking for in that specific time period, which could have tied them to Yellow Springs, are the letters that she threw out. And so she's telling him in this letter she shouldn't have to pay him for the bet because she lost, but she supposed that this letter and her signature on it would actually be her promissory note that she would pay him back. So I thought that was kind of interesting. Unfortunately, those letters are gone. We can't really tie him to the home. We do know that 2 of his children did attend Antioch College. That much we do know, but we can still say it's been suggested that his family.
Well, I'll add something.
Okay.
In the attic window, that his children, initials are in the attic window,
Oh, wow.
so.
So there you go.
And
Whoops, we're back.
And seeing the Torchlight articles from that time period after the Battle of Chickamauga, he came back to Yellow Springs. His brother was a bishop up at Springfield.
Okay.
And he lived in the house, it's in the Torchlight. I've got
Is it?
the articles at this work society.
Awesome. I need to come see you.
Not this one.
Right, I need to come see you.
And 2 more things. The Ladley letters that were published by Wright State a number of years ago, one of them talks about the Antioch students serenading her at the house after the Battle of Sons River, where he was in command. And then I've also got a photocopy of a letter that doesn't say have an address, but it's written by Rosecrans to General Meade, and it's dated Yellow Springs.
Oh, wow.
So.
So I didn't look far enough. That's good to know.
I'll add to that a little bit of history from Scott, which was during that time, there was no method of feeding the students at Antioch, so often parents accompanied the children so that they could provide meals and laundry and all of those other things. Yeah, so you think you're getting off easy.
Did you find anything there about General Scammon? In the Lambert's biography, Rosecrans, it mentions that General E.P. Scammon's family also lived in that house also.
Yeah, I didn't. Were there 5 generals?
Families lived in Yellow
Okay.
Springs.
See, and that was the problem I had because I was looking through the deed records and the tax records, so I was seeing the owners of the property. And a lot of times they were renting out rooms or renting out the house. There's really no record unless you can find these articles, and I unfortunately didn't look far enough at the time and didn't find them. But now I have that info, so I can go through that. It's great. Thank you. Okay, next slide, please. The Wolford House. Tax records suggest that this is actually the Wolford.
Did I
Connie,
actually?
you may have. No, may go forward. Okay, here we go. Wolford House. The tax records suggest that this house was built around 1857 by Samuel Buckley, who was a local botanist. Deed and tax records indicate that at one point, between 1859 and 1863, Horace Mann, the former president, the first president of Antioch College, owned this property. According to some of the early deeds, the neighboring property, which would be in between this particular house and Deaton's Hardware, was the home of the Antioch College bookstore. J.N. Wolford, former editor and owner of the Yellow Springs News, owned the property from 1920 to 1928, hence the name Wolford House. Next, please. And then we have the Wolford Cottage right beside it. The tax records suggest that this cottage was built prior to 1848. Notable property owners here include A.S. Dean, owned it between 1853 and 1856, and he was Rebecca Pennell's husband. And for those of you who don't know Rebecca Pennell, the Pennell House over at Antioch College, she was Horace Mann's niece and one of the first faculty members here at Antioch. 1862 to 1865, the property was owned by H.H. Burkholder, who was a local bookseller. He was also the brother of T.B. Burkholder, who was a first lieutenant, Company D of the 8th Regiment of the Ohio Volunteer Cavalry. And apparently the Great Army of the Republic Post here in Yellow Springs was named Burkholder Post after T.B. Burkholder. From 1908 to 1914, the property was owned by James McKinney, another veteran of the Civil War, and he was also an Antioch College board member. And then in the 1920s, when the home was owned by J.N. Wolford, the cottage here was used and housed the Yellow Springs News. So at one point, that was the Yellow Springs News. And actually, that picture up in the right-hand corner, I believe, was taken during that period.
I think briefly, just prior to 1935, it was also a temporary home for the library.
Oh, okay.
Is that the current Board of Education building?
No. Okay, next one.
Where is this?
What, the last one?
If you don't have an address.
The Wolford, where was it located?
It's on the corner of Short and Walnut Street.
In back of Deaton's or?
Yeah, behind Deaton's, and the cottage is right beside Tom's parking lot.
You come east on Elm Street, it stops on the
Okay, the Weston Fest House. This one is down here on Xenia Avenue. Tax records suggest that this house was built around 1855. A few notable property owners here. John Burns Weston, who was a professor of Greek at Antioch College. And apparently he was acting president of Antioch on 3 different occasions. He owned it at one time. Simeon Fess, also, right after Weston. He was the president of Antioch College from 1906 to 1917. And he was also a longtime member of the U.S. House and Senate.
Did Weston build the house?
No. I don't have the name on me. It was nobody that was real notable at the time. But it was built prior to Feston. I want to say it's Van Ness is his name. Let's see. The sketch down here at the bottom of the screen, that's from the 1874 Greene County Atlas. And I thought it was really neat to contrast a more modern day photo with the older one and then the sketch when you've actually got the horse and buggy on there and the farmland behind it, which you just don't see now.
And where is this one?
This is on Xenia Avenue, just south of town.
For a while it was a funeral home.
Was it? Yep. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, next one, please. The Bar House. Tax records suggest that this house was built around 1844. And the tax records actually indicated a frame house was built by William Mills. Isn't the history that I had heard on the house. Mills sold the property to a Dr. William Grimes in 1849, and the house served for quite a while as a physician's office and pharmacy. The house was owned by Rebecca Thompson and her descendants from 1894 to 1987, of which William Barr was one of her descendants. So again, hence the name of the Barr House. Quite a long history. And again, it's kind of interesting to take a look at the difference in age of those photographs. This is on the corner of Limestone and Xenia Avenue.
northeast.
Is this what they're talking about tearing down?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yep.
Resident.
Okay, next slide, please. The Hamilton Car House. Tax records suggest that this beautiful Greek Revival home was built around 1854. John W. Hamilton moved his family from Dayton to Yellow Springs, becoming one of the early prominent families in the village. In 1852, Hamilton was the Justice of the Peace who witnessed the signing of the original Articles of Incorporation for Antioch College. His signature as Justice of the Peace can be found on many of the early property deeds in the village. In addition to his role as Justice of the Peace, Hamilton was also a brickmaker. This was the property I was talking about earlier on the 1855 Greene County map. They actually show the brick kiln on the property. So this corresponded to the other information I was able to find on him. And an 1860 census confirms John Hamilton's occupation as brickmaker. According to a history of Greene County published in 1881 by R.S. Dills, Hamilton supplied the brick for most of the buildings in Yellow Springs with the exception of Antioch College. And I don't know why, I'm really curious. Hamilton served as the mayor of Yellow Springs in 1858, 1862, 1867, and 1880. In 1894, Elizabeth Hamilton sold the property to Margaret Bailey, and according to the 1900 United States Federal Census, Margaret's husband Elmer was a fruit farmer. So it was during this period that this property first began being used for horticultural purposes. And then in 1923, William Wallace Carr, the name we most often associate with the property, he purchased the property and expanded his family nursery business. Carr and his sons created a thriving nursery business, shipping plants across the country. The nursery continued to thrive until the late 1960s. And again, that's just south of town on Xenia Avenue. Next. Okay, if you're interested in reading and researching your own properties, I'm going to give you a few tips. Again, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail because we could be here for a really long time, but I'd be happy to answer your questions if you have them. If you're just interested in a general idea of how old your house is, your property is, you can actually look. There are some books that are available through the library that are very good in helping you to identify the architectural style, which you can usually then get within 10 to 30 years in terms of a rough estimate of a date. These are some of the books: Identifying American Architecture, A Pictorial Guide to Styles and Terms. I'm going to jump down to Houses and Homes, Exploring Their History. And then also another good one is A Field Guide to American Houses, and What Style Is It? A Guide to American Architecture. The second one at the top is interesting if you want to dig a little deeper, and also if you're interested in genealogy work. The book, Locating Your Roots, Discover Your Ancestor Using Land Records, really helps you learn to use those other records beyond the deeds, looking at wills and estate records, court records, birth documents, marriage records, things like that. That'll really come in useful if you want to just expand your research a little bit. And next. Okay. So tips on completing your research. What you want to do is you're going to be looking at your deed records and you're going to be tracing the chain of ownership for a property, and you're going to be doing that by starting with today's records and tracing it backwards. So it requires a great deal of detective work, so you're going to want to be prepared to spend some time examining records. Like I found out when I thought I was going to go in and look for 40 and research 40 properties. That wasn't going to happen. I would still be there and probably would be for quite a while. So be realistic with your research goals. Before you begin your research, determine whether the information that you're looking for has already been compiled. The Greene County Room in Xenia, the community library, has a wealth of information down there. Historic files have already been done on some of the properties here in Yellow Springs, historic inventories. You may want to go down and just check there first. It's a place to start. If somebody else has done the research, why do it again? Save yourself a little bit of time. And again, just be patient with yourself. With a little patience and perseverance, you can write the history of your house. And take a break. There comes a time when you're looking for that needle in the haystack and you're ready to pull your hair out of your head. It's okay to walk away for a little while. Gather your thoughts. Think about what you've been looking at. Think about what maybe you're doing wrong. It's okay to do that. And trust me, I did that a lot. There were times I wondered why I picked this as a project. And the other thing that's really important to do is ask questions. It's okay to ask help if you need it. The people that work at the offices in Greene County, all the offices that I went to, are very patient. They're very willing to help you answer any of your questions. And they know what they're doing. They've been there. They work with these records every day. So feel free and please ask them questions. The other thing that's really important is take good notes. I don't know how often I thought I had written something down, and I went to look at it later, and I couldn't find it, so I had to go back and find it again. I spent twice as much time if I had just written it down the first time, and clearly, I wouldn't have had to do that. So take good notes when you're going through your property research. And they'll be very helpful, those notes, in developing your chain of title. So what records will assist you with your research? Well, as I said, primarily I started off looking at deed records, and the deeds are the legal proof of property ownership. So in order to trace the history of the property, you'll need to begin to build a chain of title, as I said earlier, beginning with the current property owner. And you're going to work backwards from the present owner. You're going to make a complete list of the owners and their years of ownership. And you're going to want to keep in mind that this research, based on legal records, will provide you with the property owner, as I said before, not necessarily the property's occupants. And that's really important to keep in mind. Other records that I used, auditor's duplicates, which are tax records. They can provide you information regarding the annual value for property and tax purposes of a particular property. They're also very good. They notate when a building, a home was built on the property. Sometimes I could see where a building was unfinished in one year, or it would just indicate that that year a brick house was built. So there's a lot of information in there. You can also see if there was a fire on a particular property. It will notate that as well. So these records can give you a lot of information for your research. And again, what you're going to want to do is you're going to take good notes on these tax records, and then you're going to compare them with the chain of title that you started taking note on through the deed records. And you're going to compare them to determine whether or not the property owner and the person who paid the taxes on the property are one and the same. And sometimes they will not be. Yes?
Robin, I know with some genealogy studies that people have found modern technological tools like cell phone cameras and wand scanners very useful. Are these permitted in some of these?
You would need to ask.
Okay.
Some of them, yes, but you would want to ask before you started scanning. A lot of things I was able to take digital photographs of, but you would definitely want to ask no matter where you go. Another useful tool, plat books. This was really helpful, the Cox House in particular, when I was working on it. When you get back so far in tracing the records, sometimes it seems like, I told you Calvin Pennell owned 3 different properties, and it seemed to me like all 3 properties were just meshing together, and I couldn't figure out which property was which property. And so eventually, I was able to find a copy of the plat book in the Greene County office, and lo and behold, there was the original plat map of Yellow Springs that has the properties with the actual property numbers and the dimensions of the property line. So then I could match the map with the deed, and I could figure out which property was on which deed, which helped me really figure out, okay, this deed goes with the Cox property, this deed goes with the little property, and it made a big difference. So plat books are very helpful. Historical maps are also helpful. As I said, I use the Greene County map quite a bit. This map provides a look at Greene County, its townships, the major cities and roads during 1855. Sanborn insurance maps are another good research tool. These I actually used initially, and what they are is they were used for insurance assessment purposes throughout the country between 1867 and 1970. And these maps will actually illustrate the buildings and outlines of buildings, and sometimes they'll indicate the names of the businesses. So when you're looking, especially if you're doing property within the retail business district downtown, this will give you exactly, it'll show you that Oddfellows Hall, when that was built. You can actually see it on the Sanborn map. Okay, and looking beyond the property records, this kind of goes along with the one book I pointed out to you. If you really want to get to know some of the people who owned the property, you're going to want to look just beyond the deed records and beyond the tax records. So you might want to look at death records, obituaries, cemetery records, which is how I found some information about Thomas Chew, census records, will and estate records. Next, please. And again, more and more records, lots of records. Property plat, engineer survey, county road maps, all of these came in really handy when I was trying to do the research. And depending on the property you're looking at, they may or may not assist you. But again, that's where going to the offices and asking questions really helps. Greene County histories, that was really important because a lot of these folks, I couldn't find a lot of detailed information on, and some of them were actually written about in the early histories. And I was able to get a profile, at least a biographical sketch of the individual, so I knew a little bit more about them. Greene County atlases, and I skipped one, the Greene County family files. Those are also helpful at the Greene County room in the Xenia Community Library. They have files on various families throughout the county, and you can go there and you know, it'll help with your research to get some details. The Greene County atlases are very useful because at the time, folks would subscribe to these and their names would be listed in the front of the atlas. And oftentimes, besides their name, it would give their occupation. So I was able to find out Samuel Cox was a blacksmith because it was right there in the very front of one of the early Greene County atlases. City directories can be useful. Church records are also useful. I know I called St. Paul's and also the Presbyterian Church trying to get some information on some of the homes because of some of the things I had heard about them. And of course, they keep very detailed baptismal records, marriage records. Ohio Historic Inventory is another good place to look, and also newspapers. Newspapers in Greene County Community Room. Next, please. And here, these are some websites for some of the Greene County offices that you may find very helpful. I know I did. I couldn't have completed this project without any of these offices. The Greene County Auditor, Greene County Recorder, Greene County GIS. And next, please. Greene County Record Center and Archives. And I will mention, I know Dave mentioned this briefly, they are in the process of moving location. So they're currently closed to the public, but they're hoping to open up back up to the public in early February. So you may want to check out their website here if you want to make a trip down there just to make sure that they're open to the public again.
Can you say a little bit about what county records are there as in comparison to what's in the courthouse at the other?
Well, Greene County Record Center and Archives, that's really probably where I spent most of my time. They have microfilm copies of many of the early deed records. They also have the old tax auditor duplicates. They have the atlases there. I could go on and on. A lot of the records are there. Really, when I started my research, I started online with the recorder's office because I was able to, since I told you you start with the current property owner and track backwards, I could do it from home initially just to get the names and the deed numbers off of the recorder's website. But as I got, that only goes back a few years, so then obviously I had to go to the office. Then I went into the auditor's office, and you can get more of the more recent documents and records there. When you get back to the older records, early 1900s and before, you're going to want to go to Greene County's Record Center and Archives and start looking and spending a lot of time looking at microfilm and the auditor's books.
And the place they're moving?
They're moving to Ledbetter Road. What's
535.
535 Ledbetter Road. And like I said, they'll be open again early February.
Aerial photographs, did you find a good source for those?
There are some aerial photographs. I didn't actually use any, but there are. You can find some of those. I know the Archives, Greene County Record Center and Archives has some of those. I know I saw some at the Greene County room as well. So there are some that are helpful.
The earliest we have is 1920s.
Yes.
Does every Ohio county have a record center and archives?
Not necessarily.
I didn't hear the question.
Does every county in Ohio have a record center? Not necessarily.
Of the 88 counties, maybe a dozen, and probably only 6 with a professional archivist.
Dan, did you have a question?
Oh, you answered the question about Ledbetter Road. But, so what is the nature of this? Is this sort of like for public records, for legal purposes, or is this strictly?
The Record Center and Archives?
Yeah.
Oh, it's for genealogical research. It does have legal records, but it also has birth, death, marriage.
I know the probate
Deed,
records go
probate
there after
records, yeah.
when they run out of room in their office, they send it to the archive. So if you have somebody that died in 1910, go to the probate court, they're not gonna have it, they're gonna send you over to. And I assume that's true of some of the other offices too.
The births and deaths are held by the combined health district, by the hospital, Greene Memorial Hospital, from 1908 onwards. The Greene County Archives, we have them from 1868, I think it is, or 69 until 1908. Just the early ones.
Yes.
I guess because you've been going through so many of these records that cross-relate to one property, the question occurred to me, how consistent and accurate are these, or do you find a lot of collisions in the information or inconsistencies? One record has one story, another record has a different one.
Absolutely. Yes. You will find mistakes in some of the records. I know, Nancy, when you researched your property, you found a mistake. in it. You have to be very careful, and that's where the original plat map came in very handy, because a lot of times on the early deed records, they were measuring differently than we would measure today. For instance, they may say that the property line was 100 feet from the rock in the middle of Dayton Street. Which that doesn't help today trying to figure out where that is.
I have that rock.
Yeah. But they would also measure using the adjacent property owners' names. So you're not only learning about the property you're studying, you're starting to learn about the properties next door because you're starting to see their names come up. And so you have to almost go and double check with the adjacent property to make sure that it does correspond to this property. That makes sense. Just to make sure you're still looking at the right place.
Well, there's a reason they call it human error. I know there are at least 2 places in Yellow Springs where they surveyed from different directions, and this property line right here is one of them. One set of surveys started at the north end of the village, the other started at the south, and they overlap, and there's a strip between these 2 buildings that I think both property owners claim they own.
Yeah. And the other thing I ran into is some of the research I found at Indiana, there was a scrapbook that apparently, and I've lost her name. Somebody here will know it. Yes. Amelia, yes. She'd written, I guess, vignettes about Yellow Spring history for the Yellow Springs News, and a lot of those had been passed down as the history of Yellow Springs. And when I started my property research, I copied all of those and I started looking at it, and then I started looking at the deed records, and the names were totally different as to who owned the property. And I think it was probably because she may have been thinking that the people who lived in the house at the time were property owners, and they weren't necessarily property owners, they were just living there. And so again, I had different information that was, wasn't backing up what I was finding, but I eventually went with the official records because they're the official records and they're there for a reason. Even though there are some mistakes, you have to check in multiple places and compile a list. Yes?
One of the confusing things is where there are subdivisions, starting at Winter and Dayton Street, that was Oakwood subdivision, and it'll say Lot 1. And then Lot 1 Oakwood also starts again at High Street, that's phase 2. And it doesn't say phase 1 or phase 2. And that happens a couple of times where they're extremely confusing.
That's where the plat map comes in really handy to try, because you can see the subdivisions and it'll give the lot numbers and you can actually see the dimensions and then.
Well, I've been able to find one for Oakwood there that actually happened like that. And there it's 1856 when that, or something, maybe before that when it was first laid out.
1853, yeah.
Very-
Okay. Yes?
Robin, people may not be aware that if you have a library card for the Greene County system, you can access the Sanborn insurance maps online from home.
Yes, and that's actually how I did it. Good point, very good point. And the only problem I had with that is trying to print them out. But you can at least see them on the computer screen. You can do that. Yes?
One resource when you have conflicting information or incomplete information is to use the engineer's office. Not all engineers are comfortable with CAD/CAM, but those that are, when you go in there, will take your deed description and plat it out for you. And for me, that solved the issue of a mistake in my deed, which was recorded as southwest versus northwest. And I was able to plot it, and he was able to calculate the area contained in there, which made it the 7/16 of an acre that I was looking for. So with that data, I said, that's it, that's my deed. Because how many other people are going to have 7/16 of an acre in this location?
Exactly.
So that's very helpful, but that's, you have to be pretty far along before you get to that point to using that.
The other thing that's good to know is that the auditor's office, if you look up the record for your property on their real estate website, if nobody has done the property research for your property, it defaults to 1900.
Yep.
So just because it says 1900 doesn't mean that's when your property, the house was built. So just something to be aware of if you do that research.
Oh.
Yeah. Now, if you do the research and submit it, I think there's a process to update it. Yes.
Also, that brought to mind the 1976 data, I think, the survey, historical survey of Yellow Springs was done by, who was it, Kent, that did that?
I was one of the Antioch students.
That's what I thought.
As a project.
I didn't want to say that unless you said. And that's what's in Greene County Room, and a lot of people and a lot of real estate agents use that information to give you when you're looking at a house, and it's not necessarily correct. In fact, more often than not, it's not correct. Okay, so it's a starting place, but don't hold it up as the Bible.
Right. Exactly.
It's mythology.
Yes, more or less.
Exactly. So these offices, like I said, they're a variety of records. Like Nancy said, Greene County Engineer. I didn't actually use that service that you did, but they did provide a map to the Greene County Record Center and Archive, a copy of a Greene County map that really helped me to see the difference between, as Yellow Springs is called, the land between the Miamis, to see the differences between the military survey property versus our property up here in Yellow Springs, which is very different. Greene County Room, again, I can't say enough about them. Multiple resources if you're going to undertake this property research. See them as well, especially if you want to get to know some of the people that lived in the area. Another couple places you can check. Again, I said, if somebody else has done the research, you don't want to redo it. So check some of these locations: the Ohio Preservation Office, the National Register of Historic Places, and Ohio Historical Society. If somebody's done the research, chances are good that it might be there. And again, why reinvent the wheel? Next, please. And I have to offer special thanks to Annie Okiana at Antioch College. I spent I don't know how many hours there digitizing photos and scanning photos. And then of course there's a Greene County Record Center and Archive that I lived there for quite a while, looking through deed records and deed indexes. Special collections at Wright State, they were also very helpful. And these are all resources that you should be thinking of if you're planning on doing your own research on your property. There might be collections in these various locations that could help you. Again, the Greene County Room, Xenia Community Library, UCLA Library Department of Special Collections, and once again, the Yellow Springs Historical Society.
Is this all on your blog?
I don't have this up on my blog, but this is my contact information. If you have questions, feel free to contact me. You can email me, you can call me. My blog is ysheritage.org. So
Might be a good idea to put the links up on your blog.
yeah, I can put the links to the various offices up there. And kind of, I'll put the notes from my presentation as well, and that way it'll be available. Yes?
How long until you get the rest of the 40 done?
Another 2 years, probably. But now I'm addicted to it, that's the problem. So in my spare time, which is, I don't have much, but I'd like to start researching another property here.
That's one of the funniest things is when Robin wrote, said she was going to do research on 40 properties. Maybe 4.
I managed to do 12, which took me forever. Yes.
Robin, one other question. Do you have any idea how the Rosecrans letters happen to wind up in California?
I don't know what the connection is.
He moved to California and was he was representative from the House of Representatives from the district around Los Angeles. And there are Rosecrans avenues all over Southern California.
Great. Any other questions, or? Yes?
Yeah, I have one. There used to be some records, photographic records in particular, of properties in Xenia, in the old Carnegie Library. Do you know if those are now all moved over to the regular source that you were using inside the present library?
I honestly don't know, since I wasn't looking at Xenia. Do you know?
I think so.
We think
Yeah,
that they have been?
the very early historical records of the library went to Greene County.
Okay. So we think they're in the Greene County room. Unfortunately, I wasn't looking at Xenia properties, so I didn't run into those.
Okay.
But I'm sure they are. Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you all for coming today.
Thanks again for everybody coming. We've got some refreshments in the back. If you'd like to stay for a few minutes and ask Robin more questions. Our theme this year is Yellow Springs. where the people lived and how they lived. So we're going to have some other, what they did. We're going to have some other topics later on in the year on recreation in Yellow Springs. I'm going to do one in a couple months on the resort hotels in the Glen. So we'll have a number of good programs, and I hope everybody come back to hear them again. So thanks again.